Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming back so promptly. We are on time, which is good to know. And we have three really interesting presentations about to commence. And once our three speakers have spoken, we will ask them to come back onto the stage again with us. And we will then have a conversation. Sorry, we have four very interesting speakers, excuse me. They're all very interesting, believe me. I was just doing a miscount there. Four very interesting speakers who will be joining me again on stage for a conversation about the issues that they will have brought up during their presentations. So to start, the Chief Executive of Ibec, Danny McCoy, is going to speak to us about responsible prosperity.
Thank you very much, Matt, and on behalf of myself and the executive team, again, thank you all for coming to the Business Leaders Conference for 2020. As Matt said, I want to talk about this idea of responsible prosperity, because over the last 8 years, on this occasion, we have talked about what is now, I think, patently obvious to everyone, was the sheer scale of change in the business model and how much prosperity and resources this provided to our nation. The last weekend has obviously taken quite a bit of interest from everybody, but fundamentally these are about choices and a society capable of making choices, and some of the frustrations that have been coming out is something the business community has been talking about for a number of years, which is basically better lives, better business, which was about housing, infrastructure, sustainability, and the planning process more generally, to plan for a society that is responsible. So one of the great pleasures of being the CEO of Ibec is the people I get to meet day in, day out. And as I said before, I've been looking at economies for over 30 years. And I've never, in my experience, seen anything like the Irish economy in the last 5 years. And it's been really dramatic. And we see this in our general election campaign and the Business at the Ballot Box podcast, the range of voices and actors, the commonality that's coming through there, from NGOs to commentators to our friends in the trade union movement. There's a palpable belief that we're at a new stage for this island and for these two islands in light of what we consider to be not just economic arrangements, but actually fundamentally a new economic order. And I think that's, the drama of Brexit, the way you felt on June 2016, is now actually crystallized. But of course, it's kind of done so fairly silently because of just fatigue and also navel-gazing at our own general election during that time. But we were clearly in a very dramatic order shift around this island in both its economic and political structure, which I think the business community actually has a huge leadership role to take now, given the scale of resources that are embedded on our island. It is a crucial time to look at this in a responsible way, but it's responsible leadership and how to deal with the prosperity. And I'll talk a little bit about the scale of that. But for this audience, I don't really need to give all the stats again. But what I would like to say is that business, way back in 2006, and Ibec as your voice in that, knew these kind of trade-offs that I'm going to discuss about what we have to handle, about the environment, about society, about the financial capital that's required to underpin this, and about the economic model. And if you recall at the time, we talked about these four elements, these four forms of capital: human capital, natural capital, economic capital, social capital. These four elements, like the basic elements of earth, wind, fire, and water, needed something to bring them together. They needed the fifth element, the quintessential element, which is, in the case of the natural elements, the ether, but in terms of bringing them the elements together, it's enterprise. There is no society on earth that has had the type of change that Ireland has had in the last decade. None. We have been the beneficiaries of that globalization that others are experiencing, but then some. And that is the challenge that I want to talk about in terms of a responsible view of that. This is not something we're new to, trying to competing on dealing with these social, human, environmental, economic challenges, but fundamentally it will be enterprise that'll be at the heart of making sure that this is a sustainable prosperity and one that is responsible. So in light of the old argument that if you haven't been to Dublin in the last 5 years, you haven't been to Dublin. That's just across the way. Anybody who wasn't here 5 years ago wouldn't recognize where that is. The Aviva probably give it away when you look through there. But we see the drama in the private investment story that is developing in our economy. And I think, again, it's sometimes missed how much scaled investment is occurring. It is estimated that the private investment in Ireland in 2020 in machinery and equipment, building construction, and the investment in the intangible assets that are brands, intellectual property, patents, etc., could reach 120 billion euros this year. That's over 2 billion euros a week. It's an incredible sum. Today, in 5 working days, 400 million euros of investment will occur. The scale of that for a society of 5 million people in the Republic is enormous. And that comes to one of the propositions I'm putting forward is there is clearly a case to be made that business has grown too big, too fast for our society to be able to absorb it and cope with it. The wrong diagnosis, if that's true, will be to say business should be made smaller or encumbered to be much slower. What it is an argument for sustainability and responsibility is to acknowledge that the state and society needs to be part of the underpinning of this good fortune that this generation of Irish people have, to have the resources and to be able to mediate those resources in a way to continue to make this flourish. And the argument is that the dynamism we see in our economy is that there's more of us, an expanding population, and a prosperous and consumers one. And ones that look like they're on speed as well, simultaneously. And this is not just the footprint of O'Connell Street. This is now across the island. Galway as the medtech sector of Europe being an example. We see this kind of prosperity and fulfillment in jobs. And yes, we are seeing public infrastructure increase. And again, a photograph of an Ireland that a lot of people from that viewpoint might not recognize. Certainly generations of Irish people would have dreamed that some such thing could occur in Ireland, and it's not that long ago. We are seeing that type of infrastructure, but we're not seeing enough of it. It is certainly not proportionate to the scale of investment that's gone in the last 5 years. And here's an inconvenient problem for us, for those who are skeptical, is that as measured by economists, Irish GDP will have grown by 100%. It will have doubled in 6 years. That's already done. Our GDP has doubled in this time frame. And so what we're looking at is an issue of, you cannot discount this GDP measure because it is the driver of our fiscal policy, because we took a referendum decision back in 2012, 2013 of fiscal stability, which implicitly puts GDP into our constitution. And that then hampers our public finances to be able to spend relatively quickly to the forces of a wealthy society and an increasing population, to the point where the state cannot react in sufficient quantum to match the private affluence and wealth that is developing. And so I use the image here of our universities as one bellwether in where we're seeing that the public investment is not keeping pace with the expectations of the society and the needs of that society in terms of what's happening in our tertiary education system in the perceptive rankings that are out there. And these are so crucial given that the fundamental change in our economy has come from this intellectual capital, which is the new oil. And the new oil embedded in the intellectual property that's in balance sheets in corporations has been the transformative event of the last 5 years. But that's not just been a paper transaction. This is now giving rise to the tangible investment that we see with all the crane count and the building construction, but also inside the walls of the manufacturing centre that is Ireland. The notion that the Western seaboard will be alive to being the vanguard of industrialization 4.0. In the towns right down the Western seaboard, we see manufacturing of global scale taking place on the western coast. Somebody mentioned earlier about biopharma, medtech, IT. All of these global hubs and footprints means that Ireland is the model of substance we talked about, and yet as a society and responsibility, we're allowing a situation where our international rankings of our universities are going down. That's the CV, not just of the current crop, it's also the CVs and the LinkedIns, biographies of many in this room, and prospectively. And this has consequences for a society that doesn't reinvest or even doesn't realize the need for that type of reinvestment. And so that's the mediation that we're going to require in this responsibility. And so in our lifestyles, we see that other aspects is we see the congestion and the frustration and the cars that are moving at a pace. That's actually a dynamic picture. A car, there it goes. Did you see it? There it is, it's moving. Nope. It's the people are fast and the cars are slow. So in this kind of congestion and rationing that's going on, we see that rationing is occurring around housing, about road space, about care facilities, about the capacity to provide the services. So when we looked at the general election campaign for business, that's one end of the show business side of the electorate. The real issue will be the program for government. And a program for government that needs to realize the economy as it is today and where a lot of things that may happen will influence what's coming out. Paris is a very significant city for Ireland because it was in Paris that this last 5 years of drama actually occurred with the decisions at the OECD around this BEPS work, the base erosion profit shifting corporate taxes. That was a game changer. That is a thing that has driven the 100% increase in GDP. That is among the things that has given rise to the disposable income of Irish households to move up to nearly 30% now, growing at 5% a year. That is making the gap, when we come on to Brexit, between the median Irish household heading for 50% more income than their UK equivalent. So in historical terms, at this moment of inflection, and many things that may go wrong along the way, including the new economic order that's coming from the UK, with now Brexit being crystallized, we now have the resources on which to make some fundamental decisions to ensure the sustainability of our economy across a number of items. So in that regard, this idea of catching the moment is that in our discussion a little later on, we will talk about the all-island economy. And I stress the word island because this is a shared island, 2 jurisdictions. But over the last decade, the intermeshing of our business models and interactions have been profound. The work that we have done with the Confederation of British Industry in Northern Ireland, the Joint Business Council, but also with our colleagues in the trade union movement, is this won't be reversed. It is complex, and the complexity around trade will not be sorted easily. You know, we still have what might be described as a Schrödinger customs union arrangement. The cat's both alive and dead simultaneously. In the EU and in the UK, and the complexity of borders and non-borders will remain. But fundamentally, the movement of people, the movement of capital, the movement of services are as equally important as the movement of goods. And we get obsessed by goods rightly because their tangibility is significant in a driver, but it's the intangibles are going to be much more significant in underpinning our society and our business model. And so for those of you who haven't taken that road, that's the Mary McAleese Bridge in a southward-facing view towards Dublin. So what are the factors? What's the wave that we have here? Because, you know, we are an island, but we're now a globalized island. What is it that we can do to deal with the issues and the problems that we have? And so very firmly, we had 4 issues in going into the general election that I'd like to touch upon. The first is the need for public infrastructure and public services that match the private sector growth in the economy. Because in conversations with members, the issues that are coming into the workplace relate to the lack of housing, the commute times, the facilities to care, the facilities to getting GP access, to getting people into hospitals, and so on. In other words, the public realm is showing up in the workplace. Nothing wrong with that. However, if it gets mediated by wage increases to compensate for the lack of housing and the time, if we've got no circuit break to ensure that we get the delivery of that public infrastructure, which at the moment is hampered by the fiscal rules of international commitments, we then have to find a way of getting the private sector engaged in giving the resources to provide the things that they want. A comment that was singularly absent from the political hustings. Irish households have the money. Irish households live within their means. And in fact, they're not paying enough even for the public services that are currently being provided, because by living within their means, the savings ratio are at all-time highs. Our banking system has a phenomenon where households now have as much on deposit as they have borrowings. So it's like showing up to the library with books rather than taking them out, as an analogy. And so in this structural issue of how do we get those resources through our system into the investment propositions to get the functioning society going again. And that's a crucial aspect, to see the economy as it is, not as it was back in the austerity age. And so the real challenge then is to bring the private sector into the delivery model of the public investment, but as crucially, to be part of that funding stream as well. So how are Irish households living within their means? Well, they're being supplemented. They're being supplemented by the corporate taxation surge that's going through our economy, which reached 11 billion euros last year. The run rate in the last 5 years is that corporate taxation is putting in the injection of near 15 to 16 billion of surprise. So it works out at 133 euros a week or so of a check to every Irish household coming from the corporate tax largesse alone. And so while people say this is unsustainable, well, long term it probably is, but in the short term, there's no necessary belief that we will see lower corporate tax returns in the very short term to some of the naysaying views. There is equally a problem if it keeps coming at us as opposed to stopping. And the reason is that too much money chasing after too few goods is giving rise to phenomena that are experienced in other resource economies. What are those phenomena? Well, one of the phenomena is participation in the labor market. Some people don't realize that while we're at 2.3 million people at work and another 100,000 or so in this measure unemployed, 2.4 million people constitute our labor force now. Very impressive statistic. Till you look at the population, because the population has grown, and that 2.4 million people is only 2/3 of the adult population in the age bracket 18 to 65. So 1/3 of the population of adult age is not participating in the labor market. At a time of full employment and when there's lots of jobs out there, then you must say, well, why? So people have lots of rational reasons why they aren't working. You can say, well, care, services, takes 2 buses to get there, marginal tax rate kicks in for the household. These are all logical reasons for making the decision. People aren't work shy, there's a logical decision. But actually, it's an affluence decision. Because if you're truly in the austerity phase and the jobs were there to provide that income for the households, and we see this in other poorer societies, people take the 2 buses, they take the time to go and get the jobs. And so the participation, low participation, is a function of affluence in most societies. Societies that are struggling have higher participation rates. So if there's jobs there, people take the jobs. Our society, that's not the case. And increasingly, we see then that jobs require people to come into our society, so we get the dynamism that we have experienced in Ireland from migration. And we've had an incredible surge in terms of our productivity, our workplace being more diverse, more inclusive. It has been transformative for our society. But then we also have to ask, what are the Irish people doing? What are they doing? Well, some are retiring early, some take time out mid-career, sometimes don't come back for some of the reasons I talked about earlier. And also young people are taking a lot longer to get into the labor market because they're staying longer in college, doing more college courses and taking time out. And these are great things. These are great things for society to be able to make those choices because they're richer, bring it back, and so on. But it's just a function of observing the Ireland as it is, not as the overwhelming narrative of despondency and austerity, which actually is what Galbraith classically described as private affluence and public squalor. So we need to address that. And the other feature then of this claim that the public infrastructure has not kept pace with the private infrastructure is probably matched in the public services as well. Rich societies want to have better planners, better regulators, better medics, better teachers, better security. But they require people. So one stat that I think that's probably instructive about this is that we had 400,000 new jobs created since 2014. And the ratio of private to public has been 25-1. Now, I don't know what the correct ratio is, but I would contend that perhaps is showing an imbalance emerging in our society about the capacity of the expectations of a rich society and more people to the lack of investment in both the infrastructure and in the public services, and the capacity of the state to be able to compete in the labor market for those services. Probably best exemplified by what's happening in our security services and the capacity of our defense forces to hold on to people on both ends of the command chain. From the very low incomes that's been experienced by our sailors and recruits into the army, we've heard lots of the stories around that, to the taking out of the talent. So it used to be just the Air Corps used to lose out to the aviation sector, but now we see increasingly with cybersecurity and so on as well. And the capacity of a state that actually is getting smaller in front of our eyes. So you may have some ideological nirvana that you think this is a great thing, but it has consequences. It's the same story you're actually talking about each day as to why you can't get people or talent, because they're absent the type of public infrastructure and services to facilitate their full participation. That's something we're going to have to mediate in terms of the public-private misshape that is occurring in our society. The other issue is around the natural capital. And so again, here we have the natural environment and the issues about climate. But we don't even need to move away from climate. We've also got lots of local pollution issues. Air quality in Ireland is not good. Cities, because it's invisible now, it used to be smog with smoke in it, you'd be able to physically, tangibly see it. Even our pollution has become intangible in Ireland, in that the NOx and SOx from the diesel and so on permeates the air. We've huge amounts of air quality issues occurring here, which again we get very little conversation about in terms of quality of life, but then there's also the global phenomenon of climate change. And how are we going to mediate and reach our international targets without having transitions? And those transitions are going to have social consequences for activities that have to stop, people who lose their jobs and so on. So they need to be mediated through a just transition. So we're going to have to mediate around the climate, we're going to have to mediate about the issue about public provision, and then we're also going to have to mediate about the consequence of Brexit in the all-island dimension. Because part of the all-island story is the underpinning of the prosperity and the peace process. Because one of the features that has been really dramatic through Brexit is that while the Good Friday Agreement has been socialized internationally to great effect, it clearly wasn't socialized domestically. The Good Friday Agreement was not an event, it's a process. And that process is very firmly needed to have the social structures in which to bring about the type of allocation of the gargantuan resources that are at our disposal at the moment to find the right expression for sustainability. So to end, what kind of solution might we be talking about here? Well, first of all, we genuinely need a national conversation. We need a dialogue, a social dialogue, involving all of those actors, because these are not siloed events. The pollution does not stop at the border. Our action plan that we had in Ibec for the zero carbon economy takes account of the whole island consequences. It doesn't make any sense in environmental terms nor in agri terms to see the partition aspect within the island. It has to be a whole of island approach on the environment. It will have to be a whole of island approach in terms of service and the combining of the services between what is de facto a common labor market. It is a common labor market and will remain a common labor market as a result of the EU-UK withdrawal agreement. This will have to be mediated on the public-private, the environment, and on how do we allocate resources across the whole island to ensure we got connectivity and that we underpin the prosperity. So social dialogue is a phenomenon because here's the most patently obvious thing of all. The government, because of its scale now and its restrictions, will not be able to solve the problems which the electorate told them they wanted solved at the weekend, which is housing and health, without engaging the private sector dramatically. Who believes in the short term that the state could outcompete the private sector for scarce construction resources in the next 3 years? If there's a tournament between the state trying to build housing versus the investment decisions already in the pipe from businesses, but also from households in refurbishment and so on, that the state's checkbook will beat the private sector checkbook. I don't know the answer. I know which way I would bet. So you've got to engage with a process on how we break some of the log jams, and the only way to do that is get everybody representatively involved. So for the absence of doubt, this is not social partnership. This is not centralized wage bargaining. But this will involve decisions about how resources are allocated and how, as businesses, we ensure that the resources that the state will probably be looking for, already receiving through the corporate tax space, how to ensure that we get the public infrastructure that takes the pressure off the labor market relationships where we currently are paying higher wages to compensate for the lack of infrastructure, but no circuit break in that. Because the consequence of that wage paying for something that is not productivity is that you get the most monumental uncompetitiveness developing in your economy. And so other resource economies have experienced this before. Once the resource starts to go down for all kinds of reasons, you're left with a stranded, uncompetitive economy. So we have an opportunity to break that cycle now, but also take the historical challenges that are out there, but also by far wild opportunities for Ireland that nobody could have envisaged, bar Ibec, 6 years ago. And so I think that's the junction we're at. The last piece is, and probably the most fundamental because people get queasy about this, is the kind of knee-jerk reaction this week that somehow all's changed utterly, is that calm is required, right? The resources will find expression. Markets work, but markets have to be allowed to acknowledge the context in which they're developing it. And so the realization in this society is that the government is very quickly becoming impotent in the society as capacity to deliver, despite the obsession of an election that felt like the 1980s or the early 1990s, not the economy on which it is now. But optimism is these things can be solved, and they can be solved by the existing community and the existing business model. But if we don't address those, then we'll have squandered an opportunity, but we'll continue to have a very dramatic effect. So the first signpost, the very first signpost we need in a program for government, part of that dialogue is a new commission on taxation. Because I was on the last commission on taxation, which was in 2007 to 2009. And think of how a different world 2007, 2009 was. Not in politics, but in smartphones and in terms of digitalization, and in terms of intangible assets, in terms of gig economy, in terms of migration, in terms of the kind of capacities. We need a taxation system that is actually fit for purpose, but one that actually extracts the resources that the society needs to provide it to the government. And the taxation system is the model that will be used. Now, whether, with your ideological preferences, you extract the money from the households in the form of taxation, or you borrow it from the households, as in bonds to be paid back in the future against KPIs. And if you're also a philosophical problem to say, how do we get public services delivered? You can be agnostic on whether the delivery of the public services come from people who are permanently employed in the public service, or they're done by agency, or whatever way it goes. These are the conversations that we need to have, and we need to have them quickly. But the good news is, we're at probably one of the most dramatic times of any generation of Irish people in the last century. And the good news is that we're arriving at this point not in austerity, but actually at a point of affluence. And so we have to behave responsibly with that prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny, for that stimulating discussion. In fact, as I was listening to Danny there at the end, he mentioned the Commission on Taxation, which I will ask him about later in our panel discussion. But I do remember back, he brought back memories from the crash